So I want to speak to you about scaling twin transition. So what we're going to do here is go through three different parts, right? We'll start out with looking into what is twin transition. And then we'll follow this up with, well, why is scaling so important? And for the third and final part, we're going to look into how can we actually scale twin transition. So let's go. So the first issue here is obviously what is twin transition, and there are numerous definitions of this, and it relates back to policy movement basically from the EU, where we saw that they started talking about, well, how the digital transition is super important, and then how the climate transition or the green transition is super important, but then more and more they started intermingling these two, right? They started seeing the relationship between them, how they are dependent on one another. So the definition that we have right now is that, well, it's the parallel digital and green transition, or the utilization of digital transformation for green transition, right? And the rationale behind this is obviously that, well, both of these two transitions are important. The digital is important in terms of, well, we need to utilize new technology to address the challenges that we're facing. And the green, obviously, will the existential crisis of, well, it becoming harder and harder to breathe on this planet. Right? So if we look at this on the national level, we can see that, well, Sweden has identified themselves as leading, right? Or at least identify themselves as having the ambition to lead, where the government says that, well, Sweden shall be leading in the execution of Agenda 2030 and the global sustainability goals, at the same time as they say that, well, we should be the best in the world in utilizing the opportunities of digital transformation. So this is a pretty tall order by any accounts. Right? For a small nation such as Sweden, we should be the best at those two things. And obviously, from that comes that, well, then we need to be the best at twin transition as well, right? Which places an enormous strain and an enormous sort of level of ambition on the Swedish public sector and the Swedish companies, right? And the private sector. So what do we know here? Well, from research, we know that 87% of the SDGs require digital government on the highest maturity level. And what is meant by that? Well, that means that we have to have all the prerequisites in place in order to fully utilize the benefits of digital in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And that's not weird, because a lot of these Sustainable Development Goals are dependent on operational development, on changes in the way that we do things. Right? And that relates back to the core definition of digital transformation, at least as we see it as researchers, right? Where that is a method for business development where digital solutions are used for either automation or innovation. I'll just unpack that a little bit before we move on. So if it's a method for business development, is not something that sort of a factor or a macro factor in society, is not sort of kids starting to use cell phones or smartphones, right? That's not digital transformation. Digital transformation is much more about how we change our operations, how we change our behavior, how we change our routines, our processes, our structures, etc. So it is very much about business development or operational development in our organizations. So that's also means that, well, then this is something that sort of happens on the outskirts of the organizations or in the front line of the organization, rather than simply being a dialogue about strategy on the C-level of the organization, or the upper echelons of management. This actually implies that people have to change the way that they do things, and that it means everybody else in the organization as well, right? The idea here is also that, well, this is an ongoing process, so it doesn't sort of stop. It isn't a state. It is actually an ongoing process, and it's about balancing. It's about balancing between automation, or, if you will, continuing to do exactly what we're doing previously, but with fewer resources. So the aspiration of efficiency, right? The utilization of technology to replace human hands with cheaper algorithms, basically, right? So exploiting existing opportunities. But you also have to balance that with the innovation side. So the exploration of new opportunities, the trying out of something new, the risk aspects of this. So where we do not know if this is a good idea or a bad idea, we do not know if it will fly, if it will scale, but we have to sort of keep a balance between these two things, between these two sides. Otherwise, we'll end up in basically Great Landing, wrong airport. Right? We will make ourselves extremely efficient and becoming increasingly obsolete. So whenever there's a necessity for transformation, there's also this necessity to balance between automation and innovation. So if we've now gone through what twin transition is, then let's look at why scaling is so important. So for that, I would like us to start talking about the challenges that we're currently facing as a society and as individuals, as humanity, if you will. Right? We have a polycrisis going on. So there is a crisis all abound. Right? It's an actual shitstorm. We have polarization. We have a problem with democracy. We have the pandemic, or the wake of the pandemic and the wait for the next pandemic. We have demography, where we are seeing increasing amounts of elderly that are living longer and longer, and fewer young people. Nativity is down. Right? We have an energy crisis. If we're supposed to be able to transition over into green alternatives, then we need more renewable energy. Right? We have a climate crisis, an existential crisis. We have inflation, migration, biodiversity. We have war. Right? Everything is just going on at the same time with sort of immense and super interesting relationships here, right? Because they impact one another. They are interrelated, and that's the very idea of the polycrisis, right? That we cannot basically analytically separate one of these crises in order and just fix that one and then expect everything else to be sort of the same. We have to understand the interdependencies here. And when we look at those crises and we look at the current state of tech, we see that, well, I mean, for instance, in terms of the climate, well, all of the technological solutions necessary in order to mitigate the climate crisis, they already exist. We already have the working solutions that, if we would adopt them, would basically solve this. Right? The same goes with democracy. The same goes with polarization. We have these fantastic solutions, but for one reason or another, they aren't utilized. They aren't scaled. Right? So they're just sitting there. It's just a failed market. A market that doesn't really sort of, where the vendors don't reach their customers, if you will. So what we see, on the other hand, is a lot of proof of concepts, a lot of pilot projects, a lot of sort of early stage fiddling about and tinkering with the tech. Right? So we'll see one organization invest in a proof of concept for a generative AI in education. Right? And then we'll see that sort of pan out. Yeah, this is a great idea. Right? But we seldom see the scaling side. We seldom see the scaling side in one organization, and we never see the scaling on the national level. Right? So if we take the public sector in Sweden, everybody's basically unaware of what they are doing in the other municipalities and other regions and other agencies. Right? They are just sort of super enclosed and focusing on their stuff. And it even goes further than that into sort of in a municipality, for instance, in different administrations. They don't even have the transparency to see what's going on in the other administrations. So we have an issue here. We have a problem with this proof of concept cemetery, if you will. But what does that actually result in? Well, it results in a massive opportunity cost. Right? So it's super expensive not to utilize new technology that has been proven. I'll give you two examples. So the first one is about fall detection. So there have been numerous pilot studies or proof of concepts in different municipalities and in different regions about utilizing infrared sensors and artificial intelligence as a means of preemptively identifying when elderly people, for instance, in care facilities, are about to fall down, right? On account of an aneurysm or whatever, but there are clear indications so that the care staff can actually meet up and mitigate that fall. In Sweden, the total cost of those falls is massive, right? In terms of care costs, in terms of hospitalization, that's really expensive. But it is also expensive for these individuals, right? Because it's associated with a lot of pain and a lot of lying around and healing, right? That will take years off of their lives. And if it's an elderly person, well, maybe they don't have that long to live, right? So when we look at this, we can see that, well, the first sort of proof of concepts that were done, they identified a over 60% mitigation of falling accidents, right? So they were able to save 60% of care costs and 60% of the suffering through these sensors, really inexpensive sensors. When we calculate that at the total cost for Sweden per year, that's an opportunity cost of 11 billion Swedish crowns, right? So that's how much money we're continuing to spend instead of just investing in these technologies or in this particular technology. So why is this happening, right? Instead, we're seeing new pilot studies, new proof of concepts pop up in all different parts of the public sector, in the regions, in the municipalities. Everybody's doing a pilot study or a proof of concept on this technology. Why not just utilize the learnings from the first municipality that did this or the second municipality? So this is what we see as an opportunity cost of 11 billion Swedish crowns yearly, right? The cost of not investing in something. If you look at digital care of the elderly, so cameras or sensors that keep an eye out on strange movements in the middle of the night, right? And this makes it possible for the care staff to not have to go out driving in the middle of the night, go to the elderly person's home and open the door and have a look at them in the middle of the night and obviously scare them half to death. And they wake up and then they have a hard time sleeping and it affects their well-being, right? So instead of having that situation, we just have a sensor that sends an alarm if something is awry, right? Then when we calculate that opportunity cost of that, we calculate it to 10 billion Swedish crowns a year, right? Just on account of this not being fully scaled in Sweden. Right now, I think we're 1.6% or something of all the available implementations. So why is the adoption of new technology taking so long, even though we know that it's associated with massive opportunity costs, and we are in a situation where we urgently need staff, where we need to replace their hands with algorithms if it's possible, without decreasing the quality of care, right? So what we end up here with is basically a moral imperative of scaling tech, right? I personally believe that we have a moral imperative in scaling technologies, right? If there is a technology that could alleviate pain and suffering for individuals, that could help kids not fall behind in school on account of certain conditions not being diagnosed, then we should be ashamed of ourselves. If we are not utilizing the technology to its full extent, that is not free of charge, right? Somebody is picking up the check. Somebody is suffering. Think about the fall sensors or the fall detection solutions. People are actually breaking their hip bones, breaking their legs, and lying there and suffering for months and months, right? With really no reason for it, if we would have just invested in the technology. So we don't have a dearth of capital in the public sector. We have some sort of an inertia, something holding us back from actually taking this moral stance and scaling the technology that has been proven to work. So this brings us to the next step. So how can we actually scale the twin transition? Right? And what we need to look into there is the sort of prerequisites for scaling twin transition. Right. So what I want to talk about here is a specific initiative that we have running right now, the Urban Twin Transition Center. So a massive investment from the Swedish government into the University of Gothenburg, Swedish Center for Digital Innovation, RISE, Research Institutes of Sweden, and the Swedish Internet Foundation. And what we noticed there was that, well, if we talk about getting digital to align with a green transition, right, making these two things support one another, then we have to look at, well, how is it actually working right now? And in Sweden, we have these fantastic forerunners in green transition in terms of viable cities, right? So we started to interview all of these coordinators, all of the people responsible for climate or green transition in these municipalities. And what we found was that, well, there was a clear decoupling going on. So these individuals responsible for sustainability and green transition, they were placed on the side of core operations. They were placed into a separate unit, into something that would, well, it was, of course, given a lot of investments, of course, supported financially, but at the same time, it was decoupled from core operations. So the idea was that, well, as long as you don't interfere with the core operations, then everything is peaches and cream, right? And the same has been found in previous research in terms of digital transformation. So we would appoint a chief digital officer, and that chief digital officer would have a staff and would have resources to be able to drive digital transformation. But we see the same tendency of decoupling. So what we have here is basically two satellites, right? One responsible for digital transformation and one responsible for green transition, and they are evolving around the core operations, right? And never shall the two meet. So what we did then was to sort of go one level deeper and start to look into, well, what do you see as the main shortcomings of the current setup, right, from these sustainability strategists? Well, the first one is, well, when it comes to digital transformation, we basically don't have a definition. So digital transformation was extremely decoupled from green transition. There was no sort of integration there. And the second one was that, well, these individuals lacked digital competence. So they didn't really understand what digital was and what the affordances was of that technology. They also lacked this ability to collaborate across the organization with core operations and with the digital transformation teams. So there was no sort of interaction going on. They also had an experience of a very low digital maturity, i.e. the organizational prerequisites for actually utilizing the benefits of the digital technology, right? And they saw this decoupling going on, that they were placed on the side and that digital was placed on the side. They also saw that there was a lack of measurement, right? So how do we measure if we are tasked with decreasing the climate impact of our operations? Then how do we measure if we've done a good job or not, right? And they saw this problem with scaling. They saw the problem with, what if we find a good solution in municipality X? How do we scale that to all the other municipalities, the 289 other municipalities in Sweden? Since the municipalities are the ones that are sort of responsible for the cities, and the cities, well, they have 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can't get this to work in the cities, then we have a massive problem, right? So they were highly frustrated about the current prerequisites in place. But what we then did was we started looking into, well, can we create some sort of an overarching, a twin transition capability model, some sort of a framework that would identify what we need to have in place and what a solution needs to have in place in order to be validated or to be scalable. Right? So what we did was we went all through all the literature. We talked to the experts. We set up generative AI-based chatbots to pull different expert opinions and test our models. And what came out is currently this, right? What we see here is that we have three different sides to the necessary prerequisites. On the first side, we have the solution, right? Looking into the specific technological solution, right? There we are looking for openness. Is the solution open? Are they using open standards? How is the architecture of the solution built up? So is it a modern architecture? Are they utilizing the latest APIs? Stuff like that. Is there agency for the customer? Right? Do they own the data, or is it the vendor that owns the data? Do they have control of the source code? How's the interoperability? Can you actually, is there possibility of integrating this with other parts of their digital infrastructure? What about the portability? Can this solution, if it works here, move into a next use case? And is it simple enough? Is it documented? Can we understand this solution? Right? And those 6 factors or 6 prerequisites, they cover the solution side. Well, if we look at the use side, which is an equally important part, well, what's the cost of this? I mean, is it overly expensive, or is it justifiable in terms of cost? What about compliance with overarching regulations? Will this be a problem for us since we are in a very regulated environment? What about procurement? Can this be easily procured through the natural channels available to the public sector? What about funding? Could this be funded through green bonds and other types of green investment capital, which is far cheaper in terms of capital cost than other types of capital? What about the adoption? Is it easy to start to use it, right? And then is it easy to actually use it? Or does that also require substantial investments and changes in operations? So given that we've looked at the solution and the solution in use, then we also need to look at the underlying organizational prerequisites. Right? So the organization itself has certain prerequisites that need to be in place. And this is something that we know from previous research where we've looked into digital maturity, identified 25 factors that are imperative according to all what we've learned previously in research globally. So what do you need to have in place in order to fully utilize the benefits of digital? What we've done here is we've selected 10 out of those 25 through a statistical approach, looking into, well, what would explain 95% of the variance? So we're trying to go from 25 to 10 because it's a little bit easier to work with, right? There we look at cost control, right? Do we have an actual understanding of the cost of IT and the cost of digital? What about the infrastructure? Is the infrastructure modern enough to handle this? Is it continuously evolving and modernizing? What about the technical debt? Right? Do we have problems with antiquated code, lacking documentation, etc.? Or do we have the capacity in the organization of scaling new tech? Right? Do we have a sourcing strategy that meets the demands of the changing market? Do we have a working environment for our IT professionals that actually makes sense and makes it possible for them to contribute? Does the IT department or its equivalent have a good reputation in the organization, or are we looking into an organization where everybody hates IT? Right? What about prioritization? Do we have a sound process of prioritizing which digital initiatives we should invest in? What about open development? Are we open to actually inviting other people into developing solutions together with us? And what about standards? Do we understand? Do we follow the development, and do we participate in the development of standards? Right? So taken together, all of these factors, right? These 22 factors, they specify if something, a net zero solution, so a solution that will help us reach net zero, if it's scalable or not, right, in our specific context. So what we can do then is to start think about, well, what does that mean? What if we can assess that? So we can make an assessment of the organizational layer, and we can make an assessment of a specific technological solution. So what would that open up for? And what we started thinking about then was the ideas of need-solution pairing. So this idea that, well, the traditional approach to problem solving is, well, we have a problem, we analyze it in minutiae, and then we arrive at the specification for the solution. right? That requires us to actually understand the problem and invest significantly in the problem. And it works perfectly well for sort of one-off problems that are big, and if we do not have more than one at a time. But the type of shitstorm that I was explaining or talking about previously, that sort of requires something else, right? Maybe we only have a need. Maybe we don't really understand the underlying problem. And maybe there is a market for solutions. What about just shopping around, looking into, well, the municipality X, they did this with this effect. Oh, wow, that's cool. I never even thought about getting that effect, but that effect aligns with what I'm actually looking for, so maybe that solution will work for me. So a much more dynamic setup of problem solution can be found in need solution pairing. But that also requires us to sort of create some sort of centralized transparency for validated and scalable net zero solutions, right? So our problem then becomes that, well, how can we create that? If all the solutions exist, people are doing proof of concepts on these solutions, right? But there's no transparency. There's no sort of overarching visibility when it comes to what's happening in the different municipalities, regions, and agencies. What if we could create that transparency? What if, on top of that, we could validate the solutions so that we're not going to scale solutions, we're not going to push solutions into this need solution pairing unless they are scalable, right? And scalable by design. So that's what we did with the Urban Twin Transition Center. So we set up this organization, this neat little organization that will function as a way of, one, validating solutions, so looking into the different technological solutions that are used, trying to identify which ones are actually scalable, which ones have a significant positive impact on the climate, and which ones have the prerequisites in place to actually be able to scale, and how do they sort of relate to the prerequisites of the organization, right? So we need to identify the prerequisites in the organization, and we need to enhance the prerequisites in the organization to help them. Well, if you want to implement solution A, then you need to fix these things. And at present, we've identified that these three things need to be improved in your organization in order for you to actually reap the rewards of solution A, right? Because that's what we know from previous use cases that we've studied. Wonderful. And that means that we could move into scaling these solutions, actually making them wholesale available, integrating it into the processes of public procurement, saving an enormous amount of time, making it easy just to sort of, just to buy them. You don't have to spend a year through this public procurement process. Everything is fixed. We've provided you with all the details, and we've integrated it into the fantastic infrastructure of ADA, the public procurement partner, right? Wouldn't that be neat? The whole idea of this is to dramatically reduce the emission of greenhouse gas in Sweden, in the national boundary, right? There, to reduce that with 20% in 3 years. And we totally believe that it's possible because all these solutions exist. But what we thought about then was that, well, why would we stop at net zero solutions? In the Urban Twin Transition Center, obviously, yes, that's the core problem. But aren't there other solutions that need to be scaled? What about welfare technologies? What about AI for education? What about any type of digital technology or digital technological solution out there that actually solves one of our challenges? If it solves our challenges, then it should be scaled as swiftly as possible. And we should create this situation where we have this central transparency and this possibility to learn one another. So we created PIAS, basically a portfolio management solution that we disseminated to the public sector, trying to get them to utilize this to basically have an overview of their digital initiatives in each organization. And what do we have then? Well, we have a situation where we have real-time data and a database with real-time data on all of the initiatives going on. in municipalities, regions, and agencies, right? What if we could make that searchable? What if we could make that available to the public sector, even to consultants, even to vendors, right? What are the solutions currently working in the Swedish public sector? What are they doing in terms of project ideas? What are they doing in terms of ongoing projects? And what are the benefits of the projects that have now been closed, right? Think about that. So we create pios.se, right? This idea about a national portal or a national, search function, basically, where you could just search, right? So what's going on in terms of generative AI for healthcare? Well, we have these 75 proof of concepts going on, and we have these 3 finalized projects. We have these 12 ongoing projects. All right, maybe I should reach out a hand to these guys instead of starting my own project, right? Because we're all in this together, aren't we? What we see then is then we could sort of push for increased collective digital transformation, understanding a whole of government perspective on this. That, well, if we spend taxpayers' money out in municipality A, why shouldn't that create benefits for all the other municipalities, regions, and agencies, right? How can we increase or leverage all the cool things that are currently going on through centralized transparency? So net zero solutions becomes one slicing of this cake, welfare technologies another, generative AI another, etc., etc., making it possible to actually learn from one another and fulfilling the promise of actually scaling technology, not just mucking about, but actually scaling it for social good. That is what we are all about, and that is what we will be doing now. So, to recap, twin transition is absolutely necessary, right? We have to integrate these two, the green and the digital. Scaling is a moral imperative, and there are key characteristics of scalability in digital solutions, and we are now just starting to tap into these through a set of orchestrated initiatives. Thank you.